In this scene from The Outsiders, the character Johnny is faced with the horrible decision of either watching his friend die or stab somebody to save his friend. In the modern day, people often associate knives as a self-defense mechanism or with violence, but in reality it has a much more significant impact on our societies.
So, the whole universe was created from the Big Bang. And the Big Bang was a theory that everything came to be through a massive explosion when everything in the universe was compacted into something smaller than a subatomic atom. And from this explosion, stars were created, which were masses of gas and matter all put together. And when they died, the whole periodic table came from them. And their explosion was called supernovas. And when the periodic table came out of it, it created every element that we know today, which created everything in our solar system. And from this, planets started to form from dust and debris that was floating around in the universe, and they started to smash into each other over time, and this is called accretion. And through accretion, some of our small rocky planets came to be, such as our Earth. And this is a picture of a supernova remnant, which is just an exploding star with the periodic table coming out. And this is the picture of the periodic table and some of the circled elements that are found in knives, such as carbon, iron, magnesium, calcium, and potassium. And these all came from exploding stars, which came from the Big Bang.
Okay, so fossil records are one of the best ways that we can learn about knives, because just like when humans die and they leave their remains around, we can really study those and figure out what it was like at that time when those knives were around. Some of the knives that were made back in the ancient days, they were made out of stone, flint, and bone, which is basically just any really sharp, really hard items that people could find back then since they didn't have metal. Hafting was one of the things that they were doing to make sort of axes. This is an example of it. It basically just meant putting a sharp piece of rock on a handle. And that was one of the early forms of knife getting complicated. Instead of just being a little piece of chipped rock, it was actually on a handle, which meant that the intelligence was increasing. Knapping was another sort of version of that. What they did was they took a rock and they smashed it against another rock until the original one was getting to a sharper point. Knives back then had a lot of different uses. They were used for protection, of course, against animals and other hostile humans, and they were also used for butchering meat sources and other pieces of food that they would find, and they were also used for building houses and other pieces of clothing. They could just basically cut anything they wanted with them. The location of the fossils that we're finding today, it's really important that we look at the places where we're finding them, because we know that would show us where human intelligence was growing faster and where it was growing slower. Because if we find complex knives like these in a place, that we know that human evolution was going strong there and that people were really learning and becoming more complex and becoming more like we are today. Life, of course, is really important for knives because we need people and other life forms to make them. So these are some early human forms. We went from something like that, and you can see that's really not very complex. And those forms of humans probably didn't do a lot of complex thinking and problem solving. They just probably did a lot of survival skills. But once we got to something like this today, we have a lot of complex thinking, and we can problem solve, and we really know how to work our environments. Knife evolution lines up with human evolution. As the knives are getting more complex, the humans are getting more complex too. because you need the smarter brains to make those more complex knives. As humans became smarter and more able-bodied, we could make the more complex tools like the ones we have today. Today we have big machines with blades on them, and we came from just little pieces of stone that were just sharper than that. Some of the knives that we're finding have dated up to 164,000 years ago, and these knives really needed a sort of human intelligence to create. So we know that even back then, people were problem solving and they were using their smarts and their skills to make complicated things. And evolution was the reason for that, because as people were growing, both physically and mentally, they could make more complex things, and eventually we got to where we are today, where we have huge domineering cities and all kinds of fantastic things like that. And that all came from like little sticks and little rocks.
The bipedalism of humans is what actually brought about the idea of knives. The knife came about because humans needed a new food source. As the environment changed, trees became less common, so they were forced to begin to walk. As they walked, they needed a way to kill the animals that they needed to eat. That's how the knife actually began. As they began to make these tools, their brains actually became more complex. As their brains grew, also their skulls grew. Because the skulls were growing, the childbirth became harder for humans. That's why we were born underdeveloped, and we actually lived with our parents for a good 18 years, while other animals only stay with their parents for either 3 days or many months. We actually have a video showing how humans use their brains and how they paralleled the evolution of knives.
This program is brought to you by Emory University.
What would you take with you into the woods if you thought you might get lost? A lighter, a compass, a knife. You want to have a knife because there's nothing in nature that you can pick up that's sharp and you can cut with. You can make a stone tool though if you know how, and then you have your knife. There you go. Tools and stone tool making seem like this really obscure kind of esoteric thing, but in fact, in the past 2 million years, it's probably been the most common and consistent human technology done by virtually every society in the entire world. So if you want to think of a typically human behavior, stone tool making is it. So as archaeologists, when we want to study the evolution of intelligence and the evolution of the mind, we want to know what our ancient ancestors did. And the best evidence that's left to us of that is in the form of ancient stone tools, which actually preserve pretty detailed aspects of behavior. Take, for example, the very earliest known stone tools from the Oldowan industry that go back something like 2.6 million years. Simple stone flakes struck from river cobbles. Not much to look at, but in fact they have sharp edges, effective enough to use in butchering an animal like an elephant. You may ask, how is it that archaeologists know these things about these ancient tools, about how they were made, what they could have been used for? And the answer is that we've done it ourselves. And that's experimental archaeology. One of the best ways to figure out how artifacts were made and how they might have been used is to try to do it yourself. And that's a very big part of the research that I do, and it allows us to understand changes in behavior associated with changes in the archaeological record. For instance, when these very early stone tools from the Oldowan were replaced by more sophisticated forms, like this hand axe, which is characteristic of the period we call the late Acheulean, and you can already see that there's a much greater degree of design, there's a symmetry, there's an intention you can see. And from trying to make these axes, in fact this is one that I made, you learn that it's not easy to do. There's a lot of skill that goes into it and a lot of knowledge and a lot of decisions that you have to make. And this provides us evidence of evolving intelligence, evidence of an evolving mind. Of course, language is recognized as maybe the most important distinctive characteristic of modern humans, resulting in a lot of our complex behavior and intelligence, the way we communicate. And for a long time, people have wondered whether these ancient stone tools might tell us anything about the evolution of that capacity. At first glance, it doesn't seem like a natural relationship along with rock, sentience, what do they have in common. But in fact, using brain imaging technologies, we find that the parts of the brain involved in coordinating the complex behavioral sequences involved in making a stone tool actually overlap with parts of the brain that are involved in the complex sequences we're going to put together a sentence.
As you guys can see in this video, the humans used to use knives make knives by just hitting rocks together and making them sharp. Today we actually melt metals together to make a more complex and efficient knife. Today, knives are also used as collective items and in culinary and in art. They have actually helped humans evolve significantly because with the knife, humans had to problem solve and find ways to kill animals. There are also other versions of knives today that we see every day around us. Like we have scissors in classrooms. We also have batonets and swords in wars.
So our first bipedal humans were nomadic, meaning that they traveled from place to place in order to find food and other necessities. But as humans continued to develop, they started finding new ways and new methods to do this. One of these methods was known as agriculture. With agriculture, humans would use tools to cultivate the soil in order to produce crops. One of the main tools used were types of knives, and this is the sickle. This is one of the types of knives that was used during agriculture, and it was used to cut things like grass or to cut wheat. And once agriculture had become widespread, changes started occurring in the landscape and in humans, and one of the main changes that occurred was an increase in population. And this increase in population occurred because humans started eating healthier diets, they lived more nutritious and longer lives, and they were able to stay in one place, which eventually developed into what is now modern-day cities. So as with the effects of agriculture, it has eventually led us into what is known as the modern revolution or the modern era. And in the modern era, knives are being used for things that they haven't been used for in the past. One of these things being medicine. So knives such as scalpels are being used for things like surgery, and other various knives are used for other various reasons in medical fields. And as knives became more widespread in medicine and just throughout humans in general, new laws were being instituted that prohibited certain things on knives. So knives couldn't be bought and sold certain ways, they couldn't be taken to certain places, and As you can see from our nomadic ancestors to the modern revolution, humans have continued to evolve and change, and along with them, tools such as the knife have also began to change, helping humans to become better suited to the rapidly changing environments around them.
So this is a quote from Nat Friedman, and it's not really important who he is, but it's really important that what he's trying to say. His quote is, "There's still a lot to do in evolution." And I know that doesn't seem like a very complicated quote that doesn't require a lot of thinking, but it means a lot. Because over the years, it's taken millions of years to get to where we are today with our huge cities and practically owning the entire world. But we started out sitting in the middle of the woods with a little piece of sharp rock, just chipping away at it. And we've come from that to these big ornate metal knives, and we've done so much through evolution, but we're still not done yet. We're not done growing yet. If we just give it a couple more million years, we could be somewhere where no one would ever expect us to be right now. We just have to keep going and use our intelligence and our smarts and use the world around us in a proper way and just keep studying and keep working, and we can get somewhere really high. I mean, evolution is going to be a continuous process, and it's probably never going to stop. Does anybody have any questions?
You seem like lovely young girls, but why did you choose knives as a topic when there are cookies and diamonds and shoes out there?
People already chose those topics.
Who chose them?
Boys did shoes, the other group did diamonds.
It was
Knives are
rice.
cool.
So did they give you the topics and you
No,
guys
we
picked
completely
who took
chose
what?
it at random.
Yeah, they said basically do whatever we want, so we picked knives because they have such a big history, and we can just feel like we can connect them to a lot of things, and they were so important as we grew up in the species we are.
Well, you girls did an excellent presentation because when I opened it, I thought, knives, what do you think of the negative?
Yeah.
And all positives that you brought out, so
That's
it
what
was for you.
we wanted to make people think of knives not as something they should be scared of, but as a weapon, but they're really a tool that's helped us come to where we are today.
I'd also like to commend all four of you. This makes my heart so proud of you because I was one of the people who helped start the Academy, so I'm really, really proud of you. But I've got a critical thinking question for you four. If you were doing this presentation 15 years from now, 20 years from now, or your kids were up there, because Bishop Gordon will still be alive and well, and your kids will be coming here in a new and greater academy, what kind of knife, like I'm going through my head, I'm thinking cyber knife, and the things they're using right now, Can any of you think of a knife that they might be describing?
Maybe an invisible knife.
What?
Maybe an invisible knife,
different
because
kind
then
of
it would be a
metal.
weapon that you could take out and nobody would know you had it.
That's brilliant and also very dangerous.
I know.
I like the idea of a kind of metal that doesn't rust as easily and that's sharper and doesn't require as much maintenance.
Also, an idea from that is that since knives were such an early tool, today we have like machine guns and tanks. The weapon had to come from somewhere. So like it kind of started that. So for all we know, it could just keep going because machine guns are huge, but it could get even more intense than that.
Is that your topic for next year?
Well,
How do laser beams that could possibly, how do they relate to knives, do you think? Is there a relationship between laser beams and knives?
Well, laser beams cut and knives obviously cut, but I think of laser beams as more intangible than knives are because, I mean, and knives are more accessible to the public. You can't really just go buy like a cutting laser beam. So
that'd be really
I think they're sort of more advanced than a knife, but you also probably couldn't put them in exactly the same like genre as knives because there's not an actual blade on it.
For all we know, lightsabers could become really
Very good.
good.
I think you deserve a round of applause.